Getting started in narratives is often the hardest part of any story. Once you start and begin a story, it is a lot easier to continue it and finishing it. But how do we even start it in the first place? Let's get into it. Here in Australia, narratives and stories are required to be taught from a very young age. It is covered as early as kindergarten, where you have to focus on one single event, and with every year beyond that, it increases in difficulty and complexity in terms of the way it is written and assessed. It is a key component in the NAPLAN test, selective exam here in New South Wales, and all throughout high school, including the HSC in Year 12. There are many components of a narrative, but they will all require one thing in common, and that is an introduction. The way you start off that introduction or story will shape the rest of the narrative and the overall tone of what you'll be writing. The marker will assess how it's begun and will have an inclination or a general vibe of the level of writing it will be throughout the entire story. So you need to make sure you start it on a very good note. Imagine if you were reading a book. If you start the book and it is quite boring at the very beginning, there's words that are misspelled or just doesn't really make sense, and it's a bit bland or unoriginal, would you want to continue? I doubt it. There are heaps of ways you can start a narrative, but if you wanted a guideline, especially in primary school and junior high school, up until, let's say, around Year 10 level, I will go over my favorite 5 that I would definitely encourage students to uptake immediately. For all narratives, you will need a prompt, otherwise it won't be as relevant or make sense in terms of the examples that I say in this video, for instance. Remember, it is not the entire introduction that I'll be going through, but rather the beginning of an introduction, the start of the introduction, which is often the hardest part. For this video, let's use a typical and general example that we can help guide the structure of what I'll be talking about and the examples and techniques that I'll be talking about. Let's say that the question was, write a story about a time you found something interesting. The first technique or approach that you might actually use to start off this story is to begin with the sound or motion word. Students can suggest the sound that someone might hear if they find something. A suggestion could be click click, bang bang, oink oink. The next 2 sentences after this will be follow-up sentences, where you will tell the story that is about to take place and perhaps hint about the object or character that is found. So if it started with oink oink, for instance, the next sentences could be, that is the sound I heard when I was walking down the street next to Friend Park. Suddenly, I found a little piglet that I will always remember. Although if I started with the sounds bang bang or the motions bang bang, it will make the story begin with more intensity and action. So my next 2 sentences will reflect that tone that I started off with. It depends on the story that you plan on writing, as the start of the story sets the entire tone. This technique of using a sound or motion word when beginning an introduction of a story is quite effective, and I quite like this, especially because you get some extra bonus marks as you are using literary techniques, including onomatopoeia and auditory imagery. The second method you can start with is to pose a clear question. Make sure it is not a long one, as the emphasis of this is to make it thought-provoking for the reader and the marker to reflect and think about. For instance, let's use this prompt. It could be, have you ever found something so interesting that you can't sleep at night? Remember the question mark, as it is a question and will typically be a rhetorical question where you don't expect them to give you a response. In this example, you'll also need a second sentence that expands on the question you first start this narrative with. The second sentence could be, this is the story about a time I found a piglet that changed my life. It could actually be any question, but it depends on the object or character that you want your story to be based on. You do not want to write an entire paragraph before talking about the focus or key element of the story, which is why in the second sentence, You should indicate what the object or character you found interesting to be, which is the crux of what the question is. Start with it as soon as possible, and in just the second sentence, we should introduce it as early as possible. And that will allow us to be as clear and delve deep into the action of what you can expect. Another way to begin this is to use a quotation. This is words spoken by someone, but not in a conversation. You may want to make sure this is short as well, with only a couple of words. An example could be, "Look at that, you're my friend Sally. You won't believe what I found next to Friend Park." Or alternatively, it could be, "Find a piglet, pick it up, and all day you'll have good luck. That piglet next to Friend Park was the start of the most crazy day of my life." As you can see, I do not make it a back and forth conversation with two or more characters, as a story that's heavy in conversation from the get-go is telling us what is going on, as opposed to showing us. All good stories and narratives usually does the show don't tell technique. And everyone kind of knows that we don't want to tell us exactly what's going on. You want to show us through your descriptions and imagery. Just like in any of our other videos, if you find that you know the technique and the theory behind it, but you're having trouble with actually applying it to a question, just practicing a bit more. Speak to your tutor that you need more assistance in this area, and hopefully you become much better at it. There's no point in expecting that if you hear something and you'll be able to implement it perfectly the next day of the next question. It's impractical and not feasible at all. The fourth method you can use when starting a story is just start talking technique. Picture having a conversation with someone and you want to make the story sound logical and sequential. It doesn't matter if you want to start in the middle of an action sequence, but remember, make sure that you tell what happens next or where it began. You don't want to say, okay, so this is the middle of the action, and then here's the conclusion, then here's the introduction, and here's everything that's going on. Because if you're telling that to someone, they'll be like, I'm a little bit confused and I'm not too sure where you're going with the story, John. So instead, make sure that it's as clear and coherent as possible. Let's say you start off with the sentence, "One day I was walking to the park and found something really interesting. I could hardly believe my eyes." This is something that you can speak to another friend as a part of a conversation, which demonstrates the just start talking technique. And lastly, the fifth way you can begin a narrative is by doing something that students often do in stories, especially if they have trouble with actually beginning one in the first place, and that is to simply restate the prompt. It is the same way I mentioned in the advice sheet for the New South Wales writing paper or for the newspaper report Chaos on the Beach for the selected exam here in New South Wales. You want to first reread the prompt and restate it. Remember the prompt? Write a story about a time you found something interesting. You then want to rearrange the words to make an opening sentence. For example, everyone has found something. I am going to tell you about a time I found an interesting animal. This is usually something I save in my back pocket if I can't think of a better start to a story. However, there are so many different approaches and methods you can use. I've mentioned 5 already today, but remember, this is not the most comprehensive list, but it's 5 that I think is very effective for children and students to use today. I've just gone over 5 ways you can start and begin a narrative, but I want to state again that this is not a complete introduction. It is only the start of an introduction, so you will have to follow through and provide more information and context. An introduction can't just be 3 sentences. It needs to be a lot longer than that. It is by no means the only ways to begin a story too, but the good thing about a narrative is that it's flexible and requires creativity. So there's so many different ways that you can actually start a story with, beyond just the 5 that I mentioned. But the ones that I did mention in this video, I find that the students here in New South Wales in primary school and in high school as well, they actually get some pretty great marks by doing this. Sometimes you don't have to do the most advanced technique or the most complex technique. Sometimes being simple and to the point is better than doing something that's a little bit more confusing and advanced. Something I do want to talk about is it's important to understand the theory side of things and then understand how to actually use it in a proper question. There's no point in just understanding this and saying, oh, all right, I can actually use this and use it in a question. It's usually a lot more difficult than that. If you have some trouble actually applying it, speak to your tutor or speak to your teacher, and if they aren't able to help you out, then comment down below and maybe I can help assist with something a little bit more basic. But if you like this video, make sure to subscribe to this channel, as well as share this to your parents, to your mom, to your dad, to your best friend, to your friends that are also doing some exam that you're planning for. But thank you guys so much, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye.